My guest at this time is Carlin Bowman. She is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She joins us today with a close look at what we learned about American voters in the exit polls from last week's 2018 midterm elections. And Carlin, thanks so much for being with us.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Some of these have already made headlines, but you've dug deeper into the numbers to figure out what people really meant by some of their answers. And one of those areas is the issue that people said was most important to them, which was health care. But a lot of the headlines don't tell you how they think things ought to change on health care. So what did we learn there?
Well, we had two exit polls in this election. We had one from the consortium of 4 networks. They interviewed voters as they left the polls. And then we had another one from a group called AP Votecast. The Associated Press started something new, and they worked with NORC at the University of Chicago. This was a poll of people who said they voted or intended to vote, and that was conducted 6 days before the election. So in this campaign, in this election, we actually had an ability to look at what voters said and also to look at what a very large, very substantial sample of about 95,000 voters said in the days leading up to Election Day. And they asked different questions, and I thought that was really important. The fact that health care was the top response, I think, was something that we've seen in many of the polls leading up to Election Day. It's an issue that tends to favor Democrats. And one of the pollsters, AP Votecast, asked about whether or not it should be completely repealed or it should be expanded, and more people said it should be expanded than said it should be completely repealed. So that was an interesting finding, I think, in one of the polls overall. And not surprisingly, voters who put it at the top voted for Democratic candidates overall.
Interestingly, they did dial it back down to full repeal or partial repeal, or certain sections being repealed. And I believe that the combination of those two, full repeal and partial repeal, got to right around 50%. Is that correct?
It did indeed. That was a 4-part question, and it did get very close overall. So you see a divided country on so many of these questions.
Absolutely. Immigration was another one that was most important to Republican voters, and they were pretty lopsided for tougher border security policy. What do you take away most from that issue?
Well, this is something we saw throughout the campaign. If the issue was border security or illegal immigration, that tended to favor the GOP. If the issue was immigration more broadly or DACA, it tended to favor the Democrats. And so these particular polls, I think, supported that overall. Republicans are much more concerned than Democrats about border security and building a wall. I think that was evident in the exit polls.
One other issue that was expected to be pretty big because it exploded about a month before Election Day was the confirmation battle over Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Senate Republicans ultimately won the day in getting him confirmed. But it's very interesting to see how that nomination motivated each side at the polls. It didn't quite shake out like a lot of people expected.
Absolutely not. We looked at the states where a senator in a close election contest either voted for or against, and in only one state did a majority of voters say, that was Nevada, say that it was a very important an important factor to their vote overall. So I don't think it played out the way that people expected, and in all those other states, those people who had voted for Kavanaugh did well.
Is it easy to tell? Can you tell whether that boosted turnout on one side or either?
You really can't tell. I'm not sure exactly how we would look at that overall. We know turnout was very high. The estimates right now are that it's the highest in 104 years. And so it brought, certainly we had a lot of Republicans coming out and a lot of Democrats too. And so I think it's really hard to just isolate the Kavanaugh effect in that way.
Let's talk about some demographic gaps now. We've heard about the gender gap for years. Men tend to be more likely to vote for Republicans, although it's pretty close this year, and also women more likely to vote for Democrats. But what's catching up and maybe even passing the gender gap is the marriage gap. Married folks more likely to vote Republican, although by a small margin they didn't this time, and overwhelmingly unmarrieds voting for the Democrats. How do you interpret that?
That's something I'm going to watch very carefully going forward, because married voters tend to be a solid group for the Republicans, though they weren't this time, as you just suggested. And that could be a Trump factor. It could simply be disliking Trump, the way Trump carries himself and the like. I just don't know what that is, but I thought that was one of the most interesting exit poll findings. And, of course, singles have always leaned in the Democratic direction.
I don't know that I saw it in the numbers that you had in your report, but I'm sure you've combed over these things pretty carefully. So I wanted to ask you, because a lot of folks, particularly on the left, were upset that they lost some close races because they didn't get as many votes from white women as they expected. So what are we seeing there? Is it just breaking down mainly along married and unmarried lines, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but white women, and right now I don't have the numbers in my head. I've been looking at so many different groups this morning, but white women are certainly more Republican than women as a whole, and I think that I better not say because I'm not quite sure exactly what they did this time, but we are going to be watching white women very carefully going forward. Of course, white men were more Republican than white women.
And finally, let's talk about young voters. I believe it was 18 to 29, 2-1 in favor of the Democrats. Obviously, a little bit tighter in succeeding generations, but these people aren't going anywhere. They're going to be voting probably for the next 60 to 70 years, if not longer. And obviously, if these numbers persist, that's going to be a big boost for Democrats and a big problem for Republicans. So from what you're seeing, is this likely to continue for these folks, or is this pretty consistent? When people are young, they tend to be more to the left, and when they're older, they tend to be more to the right?
Well, we certainly know that they weren't a larger share of the electorate than they have been in past elections, and that was quite interesting because we heard so much about young people's enthusiasm.
Is that right?
But,
okay.
Yes, but they lean certainly very heavily to the Democrats, and that's been true for this 18 to 29-year-old group since they've been voting. It tends to be an anchor for you, the way you cast your first votes as you age, but then again, there's the old adage, if you aren't a liberal at 20, you have no heart, and a conservative at 40, you have no head. There is a conservatizing effect of age, no question, among voters overall, and so it remains to be seen whether we'll see that in this generation. If you look at the baby boom generation over time, and I've just been doing that, and this is not a part of the new report, but what you see is that baby boomers from, let's say, 1968 to 1988 to today say that they become more conservative on a whole range of issues, but they haven't necessarily become more Republicans. They moved into the independent camp, which is quite interesting. So Republicans have some problems going forward. There was a book written a while ago about demography suggesting that Republicans have some serious challenges in terms of demography, and I think that's absolutely true.
Demography is destiny is what some folks like to say about that. You mentioned that the fact that married voters just slightly voted in favor of the Democrats, but that's a pretty big shift from where they had been in past cycles. And you mentioned that it could potentially be a Trump factor. And one issue where we know there's a Trump factor is whether or not Trump was an influence on how folks voted. And you put out a very interesting comparison to how much the sitting president mattered in midterms, I think going all the way back to George H.W. Bush in 1990, where it was a distinct minority. Now this time, 2 out of every 3 votes, either positive or negative, and more negative than positive, dealt with what they thought of the president.
Absolutely, and that number has been growing over time since 1990, as you suggested. The president has become a more important factor as our politics has become more nationalized. It also makes me wonder if presidents will ever get a honeymoon going forward. I mean, something we tend to think of in their first year or two. I'm not sure that will be the case given the responses on this question overall, but that certainly is very interesting, and I think it reflects the nationalization of our politics, that presidents in this modern media age have played a more important role.
Carlin, you've been studying polls for a number of years now. As you look at these numbers, and we talked about what's stood out to you, what are you going to be most interested in following going forward now and seeing whether we're seeing some of these trends set in or whether this happened to be a unique midterm in a number of ways?
Well, of course, we're going to be watching President Trump and how his approval rating changes over time. But in terms of demographic groups, there's an adage in demography, and I'm not a demographer, that says density equals Democrats. If you're in a central city, it's going to be Democratic, and the farther out you go, it becomes more Republican. But the suburbs are looking, in recent years, somewhat more Democratic, and the exurbs too, whereas the rural vote is very Republican still in many ways, and that's suburban, urban, ex-urban mix is going to be something I think we're watching very closely overall. A lot of my questions about what these numbers show have to do with the Trump effect. Was it just something personal about him? I mean, his approval rating has been underwater for a long time. He's roughly up at around 44-46% now, and in a lot of polls that's not bad at this point in time. Other presidents like Obama had a low rating at that point. So did several others, but still he's pretty central and will be central as we move ahead to 2020.
He seems to have less fluctuation in his poll numbers than at least the last two presidents. I mean, George W. Bush, of course, got stratospherically high after 9/11, and then by the time he left, he was hovering around 30 or maybe even a little bit below. And Barack Obama came in with probably about 2/3 approval, and during some of the darker moments around Obamacare and some of that, I think even below 40. So,
yes, he was.
But with Trump, it doesn't seem to be that big of swings. So
absolutely, it doesn't move much. It's in that 38 to 44 range almost all of the time.
So you either love him or you hate him, basically. There's no
exactly, and people made up their mind early.
Yeah, wow, that is so fascinating. And now, of course, he will be on the ballot for the next cycle, and we'll see what impact that has on all the other races that'll be on the ballots as well. Carlin, it's always fascinating. Great to talk to you. Thanks for your time today.
Good to talk to you. Thank you. Bye.
Carlin Bowman, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.